Hey, greetings, Smashing members. It's Scott here in Canada, Bruce I'm assuming in the UK,
In the UK, sir, yes.
and Andy Clarke. And where are you from,
Hello,
Andy? Where are you at today?
I am in North Wales. Welcome to my studio. I'm up in North Wales, which is, for those people not in the UK, it's about an hour from Liverpool and an hour from Manchester, up in the northwest.
Your studio looks very much more professional than either of ours, I'd have to say.
Well, yes.
Maybe not anymore.
You can't see my apes, but what you can see behind me is my growing collection of Godzillas.
Ah, very cool. There's a new movie coming out. I don't know if you've heard.
Oh, yes. No, I've heard.
Yeah, but his studio was a designer's studio. I'm a coder and writer and activist, which is why my home office is an utter shambles. And of course, Scott, we know that you always climb to the tallest hill in Saskatchewan with those two immobile people behind you to gaze
One
at the
day,
stars.
one day we're gonna jump. We just don't know when.
Oh, you're on your jumper watch. I see.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So I guess my first and only question before we get things started is the stereotypical Smashing membership interview question is, Andy, are you a fan of cats or dogs more? Which one and why?
Okay, yeah. So we had a cat for about 18 years. She's in the garden, and I basically, well, she's buried in the garden now, and I now talk to that cat more now that she's dead than I did when she was alive. Poor Lucy. I walk past her every day on the way to my car, and I say good morning or something like that. So I quite like a cat, but I'd actually more like a dog. I'd like a miniature schnauzer would be my next dog if I could. But after the last dog that we had, which was the worst chocolate Labrador in the world, I'm not allowed a dog. I've run out of pet points with the wife, and I'm now no longer allowed a dog.
So that was with the wife. That wasn't legally that you're not allowed to have a dog, right?
Yeah, no, it's not legally. This, like, the RSPCA wouldn't come round and say, we need to take this dog away for its own safekeeping. The wife just won't let me have a dog after the mad chocolate Labrador that we had the last time.
I have a question, Andy. Is the reason that you say hello to Lucy on the way to your car related to the manner of her demise? You didn't run her over or anything, did you?
No, I don't feel guilty about that at all. No, she just got old, and one day we just found Lucy, poor love, and that was the end of that. So yeah, I don't know. I talk to my car. I talk to my Godzillas. I talk to most people, really.
And now you're talking to us, and Lucy is now in the sky with diamonds, which is
she's in a hat box in the garden, poor cat. Anyway,
on that note, I'm going to step back and kind of hand it over to you guys.
Don't step back too far, mate. The edge is close.
Thank you.
So, Smashing members and people watching on YouTube in the future, I hope the future's nice for you. I hope Brexit went well, and I hope you are all flying around in cars and enjoying robots being your slaves. I'm here with an old chum of mine, Andy Clarke, and I must have known Andy now since pre-Cambrian times in internet years. I have a feeling we met in 2005 at the first web conference in the UK at Media in London. Is that right, Andy? Memories fail us at our age.
Yes, I think we might have come across each other slightly before that, actually. Were you part of the Accessify forum that Lloyd used to run?
Yeah, I was indeed, yes.
Which takes us back even before then. I think it takes us back to like 2003, possibly.
Something like that. I can certainly remember you and I riding our penny farthings, hunting stegosauruses with King Henry VIII. What times they were.
Yes, and I look back on those times with affection, Bruce.
We were young, we were cheerful, we were, well, I didn't have a good shirt then, so some things have changed.
But yeah, no, it's been a very long time, mate. And it's good to see you looking so well as well.
Thank you, buddy. It's good to see you looking chipper. And it's a significant day in Clarksville because you've released a new book, which I believe a Friendly Neighborhood Smashing magazine has published.
Yes, I know. It's a big day. Big day.
Exciting.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's the closest that I'll ever get to knowing what it's like to give birth. I'm perhaps should leave that one there. But no, it's a really strange thing from a creative point of view that you work on something for a long time, and this one took pretty much a year. And then all of a sudden, you put it out there and you hope that people are going to like it. And so it's an odd feeling. The other thing, there's almost that kind of feeling of grief in a way, because tonight I won't have to sit up till, gone midnight working on stuff relating to the book. It's kind of a bit weird, really. So I'll be able to watch My £600 Life and not be thinking about, what work I need to do on the book.
Maybe you could just start another book tonight.
No, I think I'm actually going to watch a fat program. I'm going to watch My £600 Life, Where Are They Now, which is one of my favourite TV shows.
Good. And talking of different types of mediums, media even, Andy is going to be giving us a talk today on art direction. My being a grunty old coder and an English literature graduate, I don't even think I knew before I looked at the proofs of your book what art direction really is. So I'm really looking forward to this. So rather than ask you questions which preempt your talk, Andy, I'm going to disappear into the background through the magic of the Zoom turn your video off button and let you take it away, good sir.
Yeah, this is the topic of the book that I've just released today, available from Smashing Magazine. But I'll give you a little bit of the background to why I wrote the book and why I became so interested in this area, because it is something that I wasn't familiar with too much either in terms of the actual mechanics of stuff. And the reason why I kind of started off down this journey was, I think, like a lot of people, I just got really bored with the web. And I know we've all seen those kind of "which website layout are you designing today" tweets, John Gold's famous thing. But it kind of went beyond that for me. When you've been working and doing the same thing for such a very long time, back to the Precambrian era, as kind of Bruce mentioned, you do begin to kind of question where the pleasure comes from. What is it that I'm actually getting satisfaction out of doing? And I've got to say that I found myself really just doing what I felt was designing attractive containers for things, rather than getting to the actual substance of, why this design was important, not just to me, but to the people that were communicating it, my clients, and to the audience as well. And I just thought there's got to be something more than just filling attractive containers. And I actually began to do some projects with a friend of mine called Mark Porter, who, if you buy most books about art direction or editorial design, he'll come up at some point. Mark was the creative director at The Guardian and was responsible for the kind of the big famous redesign back in, I think it was 2010. And we started working on some magazine and some newspaper projects together. And that really opened my eyes to this whole kind of area of editorial design. And from there, I started really to do a lot of reading and a lot of collecting of material. And that really kind of just opened my eyes to this whole area of design, which has been in print, in advertising, in magazines for you know, for 100 years or more. But we just didn't talk about online. And funnily enough, I was reading Jeffrey Zellman's book, not the one that you'll probably remember, not Designing with Web Standards, but a book that Jeffrey wrote in 2001, which was it was written for print designers, and it was called Taking Your Talent to the Web. And in that book, he wrote that art direction wasn't something which was discussed in relation to the web, mainly because design schools didn't teach it. And it just got me thinking about who designs for the web and all of these different places that people come from, all these different disciplines, and they end up designing things for the web, but nobody's actually taught this stuff anymore. And I thought, right, now it all makes sense. Now I need to write the book. So that's the reason why this whole thing came about. So I've written a book. This is the kind of one in a series of books that I want to do over the next year or so. But, you know, this one is really about art direction for the web, particularly what it means and why it matters and who can do it. And, you know, most importantly, how I think that considering art direction can improve the things that we make for the web, be they digital products or websites in the various forms that they come in. So what I want to talk about today is actually kind of much bigger than the book in many respects. It's about improving what we make for the web. I just want to say I am going to show a couple of examples that show images of violence through some of the art direction examples that I'm going to show. So they'll probably make you feel uncomfortable, and that is their intention. So not wanting to sort of set out to offend anybody, but that's what to expect. So I just want to start off with a quote. Actually, this is a quote from Bill Bernbach, who was probably one of the most influential figures in modern advertising. And this is how I start the book, and this is really why I think these things are important. The truth isn't the truth until people believe you, and they can't believe you if they don't know what you're saying, and they can't know what you're saying if they don't listen, and they won't listen if you're not interesting, and you won't be interesting unless you say things imaginatively or originally or freshly. And this is really important because this gets to the heart of what art direction is really all about, certainly for me, which is we're not just designing pretty containers to drop our content into. If we're going to communicate something, be that why you should buy a certain product or visit a certain website or sign up to a certain service, you've got to be saying something clearly to the audience. And it's not good enough just to kind of pull some generic content, generic container off the shelf from a framework and just throw your content in there if you want to stand apart from everybody else. And that is really what this whole thing is about. It's about communicating ideas and messages through design. So I want to start off just by showing you a couple of stories. This is two examples of art directing a news story. It's about the US DEA's longest running drug cartel case. And both of these pages contain the same written copy and a lot of the same photographs. Now, the one over on the left-hand side here, this is from the Atlantic magazine, and this is where information is presented in a manner which is kind of intentionally matter-of-fact. You know, it makes the reader think that the Atlantic is a balanced and reliable and credible kind of news source. Whereas over on the right, this is the same article that was published by ProPublica. And in this version, illustrations convey violence in what's like an intensity that you just wouldn't be able to stomach if they were using photography. And these illustrations, they make people feel tense. You know, they want people to be terrified and have a very strong reaction. And that's actually okay, because, you know, people should experience those kind of emotions when they're reading about shootouts or melting drug dealers in acid. And it's the process of evoking feelings like this, which is called art direction. And these two stories were exactly the same, but they were art directed with two very, very different goals in mind. The Atlantic was much more conventional, wanted to inform people, for them to feel kind of okay. Whereas the example from ProPublica was designed to put people on edge and make them feel anxious about the situation of what was going on in Mexico in relation to these drug cartels. And the design decisions that were taken by these two publications depended on factors which I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes. So what are we talking about when we're talking about art direction? This is a kind of definition of mine, which is that art direction uses design techniques to intentionally evoke an emotional response from someone when they might read an article, or they use a product, or they visit a website. And, you know, when they were art directing their version of that drug cartel story, ProPublica chose a much more dramatic direction because they wanted people to feel appalled by what they were reading. You know, those emotive illustrations of chaos and violence and death helps to stimulate those emotions, and they shift people up an emotional scale towards being, you know, really appalled about what happened. Whereas in the Atlantic, because they'd chosen a much more conventional approach, that needle moved a lot less. And people do pay attention to powerfully art-directed stories. They get noticed. This is also from ProPublica. This is a story which actually won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. And this story is even more notable because it was actually written by two journalists. One was from a woman's perspective, the other was from that of the police. And instead of merging those two voices together, which often editors do, in this particular case, they were kept separate. And the art director, David Slate, recognized that there were two timelines and two alternating voices, and that made the story more powerful. So what he did was to emphasize those distinctions through the choices that he made in design. So the woman's story uses specially commissioned illustrations to be much, much more emotive, whereas the police story uses photography. Her story is told on the left-hand side of the page, and the police's story is told on the right. And the introduction and the epilogue, things that are relevant to both pieces, are placed in the center. And this is a very simple way of using layout to describe what's actually happening within the story. And this is a really compelling story, which is told much more emotively through the design decisions that David Slate made. Now, I know, right, that some people are sitting there thinking, well, I design products, I work for an insurance company, I work for a government department, we're not telling these kind of stories. Maybe you're raising money for a charity, or you're working in government and you want your design to kind of reassure people. If you're designing digital products, you think you want to focus on the experience of people using them, or you might have a website which sells physical products. But stimulating the pleasure of buying or using a product through design is still art direction, and creating positive experiences by stirring people's emotions and motivating them, that's art direction too. And art direction brings clarity and definition to our work. You know, it helps our work convey a specific message to a particular group of people, and it combines art and design to evoke these cultural and emotional reactions. And as Dan Moore said, without art direction, we're left with dry, sterile experiences which are easily forgotten. And if you're anything like me, if you're working on a product or a website, or you're designing email newsletters or login screens or an onboarding process, the last thing that you want is to feel that people to feel that your designs are dry and sterile and easily forgotten. And art direction can prevent that from happening. So I spent a long time really just studying design again. I did a fine arts degree back in the Jurassic period. I wasn't a graphic designer. I didn't train in marketing or anything like that. So a lot of this stuff was very new to me. And, you know, I kind of came to it a little bit like a kind of kid with big open eyes, finding out all of this stuff and discovering people that had worked in different media and thinking, wow, you know, there was a lot of very interesting and very clever thought being done by a lot of people going back a lot of years. Where is the thought that we are making for the web? What is our kind of contribution going to be? So it was fabulous to kind of look back and actually find so much interesting people and interesting creative work. And this was one of the guys that I found that I became almost obsessed by his work. This is Alexei Brodovich, who was an art director at Harper's Bazaar magazine back in the kind of 1930s and 40s. And this is a guy that before he moved to America actually beat Pablo Picasso in a poster competition. And he worked across fabrics and jewelry and graphic design. Particularly, he had an interest in painting and photography. He was a very skillful photographer. In fact, he actually taught people like Diane Arbus and Richard Avedon. And in 1934, Carmel Snow, who was the editor-in-chief of Harper's Magazine at that time, came across Brodovich's work. And she said that, I saw a fresh new conception of layout techniques. And that's the important thing, layout techniques. And it struck me like a revelation. Pages that bled beautifully, beautifully cropped photographs and typography and design that were bold and arresting. And that's a real signature of Brodovich's work. You know, he instinctively knew how to combine images with written content, something that we seem to have largely forgotten how to do on the web. And he often turned text into shapes which contrasted with or mirrored the forms that he was showing in his photography. You know, it's really obvious when you look at these layouts that it was his knowledge of photography that gave his work this kind of classical feel. And it's really interesting. I actually find his layout sketches the most interesting because often I learn more by looking at somebody's work in progress than I do at a finished result. And his sketches really show how the photography and the writing are intimately connected. And that's not any less relevant on the web today as it was in print in the 1930s or 50s. Now, the other person that I discovered who I've become, well, certainly obsessed by is a woman called Bea Feitler. Reach behind me to my bookcase. If you're watching the video, this is the most expensive book I've ever bought. I'll put a link in the article notes. This is a design book about Bea Feitler. And she was one of Harper's Bazaar's first female art directors, together with Ruth Ansell. And in 1965, she actually cast the first black model on the cover of a mainstream fashion magazine. And she worked with photographers Richard Avedon, David Bailey, and Annie Leibovitz. Little bit of a story for Bruce here. Annie Leibovitz actually made me a cup of tea once, very kindly. She took pity on me standing in the corner of a photo studio and asked me if I wanted a cup of tea.
What?
Yes, I know. Amazing.
Why were you in a photo studio with Annie Leibovitz?
I was delivering and setting up some lighting equipment in a fashion studio.
Well, I still hate you.
The other interesting thing about, you talk about the circles that people move in, Bea Feitler actually kissed Andy Warhol. There's a very low resolution picture of that event. But, you know, in the art and the fashion and the design world of New York at that point, you know, everything was incredibly connected. And, you know, I just wonder sometimes whether, you know, whether web designers, stay in bubbles, you know, and we don't think that necessarily what's going on in graphic design or print design is relevant to, you know, the very important work that we do on the internet. And I think that's a little kind of little short-sighted. Bea Feitler had this amazing creative partnership with Ruth Ansell, and she also had this really close collaboration with photographers like Richard Avedon, and it resulted in iconic, famous covers like this pink space helmet. And there was also a photograph by Annie Leibovitz of a naked John Lennon on the cover of Rolling Stone. And what was interesting about Feitler was that it was her kind of bold choice of models and photographers, and how that really reflected the changing cultural and political landscape in the US. And it just kind of characterized this kind of optimistic mood that there was in the US at that time. Sadly no more. But I think that one of the interesting things about Bea Feitler, that I certainly took away from looking at her work, is that she just had real conviction, and she made these amazingly bold choices throughout her career. And that's something that I think that, you know, we have lost certainly over the last decade in terms of web design, where we think, you know, I have a conviction, I have an idea, I'm going to drive this forward because I believe that it's the right thing to do for the web or for this project or whatever it might be. Whereas, you know, often we just tend to kind of delegate our design decisions to a bunch of user research or focus groups or user testing or whatever, and have these decisions validated rather than actually having the courage of our convictions. And that's something which Bea Feitler certainly had. You know, there's only one book, this book that I bought, which is actually published in Portuguese. It's really hard to come by, but if you can get a hold of a copy, it's absolutely fabulous. And then the other art director I just want to briefly touch on is a guy called Neville Brody, and he was art director of The Face, which is a fashion and music magazine in Britain until about 2004. Bruce, you're going to remember The Face, aren't you, as an old punk?
Oh yeah, I remember The Face.
And in fact, you might even be on the cover at some point. And this was this was a fashion and a music magazine that had this rebellious attitude to the establishment. You know, Brody himself had this opposition to everything that he felt was kind of establishment or bourgeois. And The Face wasn't like anything that had kind of come before it. In fact, Brody said that he treated The Face like a living laboratory, you know, where he could experiment and then have it published. And the golden rule was to question everything. And I just love that attitude. I love the attitude that, for Christ's sake, you know, the web is like 20 or 25 years old. And what, we think we know it all now? You know, we need to have that kind of rebellious attitude where we can challenge conventions. And that's something which Brody did incredibly well. I mean, it's not to say that he was, you know, throwing out the rule book. His work was very, very heavily inspired by Dada and by constructivist graphic design. And, over the 5 years that he was art director, he used a lot of deconstructed typography and these thought-provoking layouts, which completely changed the magazine industry. And it helped redefine the British music press, certainly from the 1980s onwards. And it became this pop culture mirror to the political and the social turmoil which was going on in Britain during the 80s. So I expect a resurgence of magazines like The Face now that we're in a kind of Brexit island situation. But least said about that, the better, really. And what's interesting about all of these talented art directors is that they made work that not only just stood the test of time, but it's become iconic. And we'd be fools if we just mimic that. I see a lot of tutorials or articles online about a lot of the possibilities that we can now do with things like Flexbox and CSS Grid, and let's go and reproduce an old magazine layout, or let's reproduce a jazz poster, or whatever it might be. The point is that it's not our job to just mimic the work that was done by people in a different time and on a different medium, but what we can do is we can look back at what made that work interesting. We can look at what problems they were trying to solve and then think, how do we solve those same problems on the web? So art direction doesn't happen just on the pages of a glossy magazine or in an advertising agency. It should happen every day when we consider how we want somebody to feel when they're reading content or buying something in a store or signing up for a product. And I know that sounds a lot like UX design, and it is, but it's also a hell of a lot more. I think that we've got the knowledge and the tools to really match the achievements of those great art directors, but we should do it in our own way. And it's time to really get to grips with doing that. So what I did when I was preparing for the book was I actually made some designs for this thing here. This is Wheelman, which is an app for, basically it's Uber for getaway drivers. So if you're planning to rob the local post office or betting shop and you want a getaway car, then yeah, you can just you can book your getaway driver, and he's going to take you to your safe house or to a private airstrip, or I don't know, the corner of a car park where you're gonna torch a car. And also there was a companion website that I designed, which is basically just full of what I think are interesting layouts and also information about how to get away, make a quick getaway after you've done a robbery. And what I was really sort of thinking about when I was putting these things together and thinking about the content for the book was that people come to the web from so many different backgrounds. And not everybody that's now designing products or websites went to a graphic design school. They weren't taught whether to choose one type of grid over another, or how to understand symmetry and asymmetry and contrast and scale, and what those things actually mean when we consider designing for the web. And these aren't new principles. These have been these are guided art direction and design for decades, and they're just as relevant as they ever were for magazines. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just quickly whizzing through some of the principles that I talk about in the book and showing a few examples of how they can have an impact on products and websites. I'm going to start off by talking about balance, because when design elements balance, a composition somehow feels right, it feels solid. And people can stay engaged with a design as a whole because not one part of it is demanding attention. So if we look about that, why does it matter? Well, a balanced design makes people feel comfortable. So for a composition to be balanced symmetrically, there needs to be an equal amount of visual weight on the side of of a central axis. So here you've got both circles being the same size and both having identical visual weight. And likewise, the following couple of compositions are balanced symmetrically, this across a vertical axis. And the two sides of this composition, they don't mirror each other, but the small circles over on the left-hand side have the same equal visual weight to the large circle on the right. So the composition feels balanced. Whereas you can create asymmetry by arranging elements where there's no apparent relationship between them. So here, this one circle is not just bigger, but it crosses this line of symmetry. And when there seems like there's no relationship between color or size or shape or even the amount of white space, designs can then feel much, much more energetic. So I've been obsessed not only with CSS Grid and old art directors, but also by organized crime and criminals, particularly in the 1960s. Organized gangs like the Krays in North London and the Richardsons who were south of the river. And all my examples in the book, being a hard-boiled book, obviously there has to be a theme, and this particular theme is crimes and criminals and getaways. So in this next example, I just want to show you how there's a horizontal axis which cuts this layout in two. And the reason for that is that the Thames in London cuts the city in two. And that's an important part of the history of organized crime in the 1960s in London. You had gangs in the north and gangs in the south. And representing that division is something that could be done through design. Now, these two gangs were absolutely bitter rivals. But this design somehow feels harmonious, feels balanced, because both sides of the river are equally weighted. You know, their content is almost symmetrical. And the images and the text that describes these two gangs are weighted equally. This is a symmetry which suggests an equality between them. And I might change the arrangement for a small screen, but I'm still able to maintain that balance. But although it's not explicitly stated in this article's text, the Krays had a huge dominance over London criminal underworld in the 1960s. They were a much bigger firm than the Richardsons in the South. So to portray that through design, what do? How do we actually suggest that without explicitly saying it? Well, one way is to check visual weight, to add more visual weight in the north of the layout by increasing the headline and the image sizes to portray this imbalance. You know, this is one design. It comes closer to pure symmetry by pulling both the alignment of both of these columns in towards a central vertical axis and then placing the images on the opposite sides. But one of the downsides of symmetrical layouts, and we see symmetrical layouts all over the web. You know, you just take a typical Squarespace or Bootstrap layout where you think, I know, I'm going to divide this into 2 or 3 or 4 columns. The problem with that is that things can really, really easily feel static and predictable. And when something lacks energy like this, it's not going to keep people interested for very long. So we can actually create movement by using asymmetry, asymmetric columns. And this is going to hold people's interests for a lot longer. You know, I see designs that are set around horizontal and vertical axes pretty much every day, but hardly ever do you see something which is based around a diagonal. You know, once in a while you might spot, you know, a nice big jumbotron that's had the bottom cut off on a banner image, but they're usually decoration. It's not essential to the meaning of design, and it is hard. You know, you can't have pure symmetry on the web because we don't know how we don't know the dimensions of the viewport, the browser window. But it doesn't mean that we can't still use diagonals to encourage people's eyes to flow across and around design elements in a composition. So here, the diagonal in this design, it draws the eye from the upper left down through the lower right. And if we add more visual weight over on the right here, this reinforces the Cray's dominance over the Richardsons at the bottom again. And the results can be even more compelling when you combine diagonals with changes in scale. This big headline here and the white space around it balances the full height image over on the right hand side. This is Mad Frankie Fraser, who was a gangland enforcer in the 1960s. There's very little tension in this design because of the balance of the visual weight. But just by contrasting this large image with a much smaller headline, all of a sudden you just make this composition feel intentionally unsettling. And yeah, you absolutely should feel unsettled when you're looking into the eyes of a stone-hearted killer. You just see the comparison between the two and how much more tension there is over on the right-hand side rather than on the left. And we can do the similar thing with radial balance. Very rarely do we see things emanating out from a central point. And this can be really effective when the content is much more graphical because it focuses people's attentions on critical areas. So, there's any number of different ways in which we might have examples of radial balance. This is a great example, I think. Ronnie and Reggie were at the center of 1960s London gangland activity. So how do you represent that? How do you demonstrate that through design? Well, you put the twins dead center and then you have all of their associates radiating around them. And this can be used in all kinds of different ways. So we might create stylish navigation elements or, radial navigation that fits in really well with the branding of this Wheelman website. And we might also take that a step further and actually integrate that radial aspect in the design of the navigation that we might choose on a smaller screen. It keeps the most important links within easy reach by arranging them in bands that radiate from the bottom corner of the screen. And controlling flow in designs like this is incredibly important because it lets people know when to start and then it guides them from one part of a design to another. And if we're going to get this flow correct, we need to think hard about content structure and what we want people to see and do first and then second and then third. So we might use things like bold headlines and dominating images with visual weight that draws people's attention towards a focal point, and then lines and repetitive text blocks and other visual cues that guide people across the direction of travel. In this particular case, left to right. So in this particular design, I'm going to combine the visual weight of the headline and the image to draw people's attention to that top left corner. And then this series of repeating text blocks, which leads the reader across the page. And I might reinforce that horizontal reading direction, make it easy to scan just by really simply putting a horizontal line underneath those columns. And then if I want to interrupt that movement, if I want to interrupt that or change that flow, I can use lines which run perpendicular, and this vertical line forms a barrier between two areas, which might be two different parts of the story or even two different stories. And I might have one narrow column of running text, which makes this vertical flow in the design really visible. But there's another line which is giving this composition energy, and that's that diagonal line which is running from the headline round down through the copy towards this image in the bottom right-hand corner, which is creating this dynamic diagonal. And there's extra tension on this particular layout because the image bleeds right off the edge of the page. And here's an example where we've actually got two flows, two directions. And we can use design to help people understand the structure of a complex page like this. So we've got one story about the Richardson gang, which is running across a horizontal axis. We've got another about Mad Frankie Fraser, which is conveyed down that vertical. And people could easily find that kind of layout confusing, but we can use design to help them along. We can pull the entire content of that central column up. We might set that column using a darker typeface or a sans serif to contrast between those two stories. And you know, there's other ways in which we can use layout to tell the stories through design. If we think about the Cray twins in the 1960s, Ronnie and Reggie, they were inseparable until they were both banged up for 30 years and spent the rest of their time in prison. And you know, when we can look at a story like that, we can think about the tension that was involved in this particular relationship. So if balance creates harmony, then contrast adds tension. So this layout brings those two twins face to face. We've got these solid blocks of running copy, and then we've got a vertical headline, which kind of brings everything together to form this solid unit of content. And we might do little things, little touches in design. We might use these tiny little arrows just to point towards the center. Or point down on a small screen to tell people where they should start reading. Whereas when these two twins were separated, there was a void, and we need to create that same feeling through the design. So very, very simple, just to move that vertical headline away from the central point, move it to the edge and leave that column empty, which kind of represents that void. And, you know, how does this work on a small screen? Well, we have to think about things differently. We might actually split those images up on a small screen and have these guys facing in opposite directions to maintain that tension. And the guy that actually put these two guys behind bars was Inspector Nipper Reed of Scotland Yard. And he was the guy that came between the twins. So how do we represent that through design? Well, we represent it by putting him between the twins and separating them literally. And we can actually reinforce the difference in stories there between his story and the twin stories by, you know, using different typography, using a different typeface. Or we might use type expressively. We might use type in all kinds of different ways. We might use layout to focus people's attentions on different aspects of a design. So we might borrow rules from photography, like, for example, the rule of thirds, which is going to create some really interesting focal points to position headlines in the center of these cars. These kind of things can just be equally important on smaller screens as well. This is the stuff that I really want people to understand the foundations of, because they can inspire much, much more interesting and unusual designs. Now, I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm conscious of our time. And I've got to confess to Bruce that I didn't actually find out how long this was going to take. So how are we doing for time, Bruce? How long have we been going?
We've been going 40 minutes.
Oh, we've only got sort of 5 minutes, really.
And then we've got a few questions at the end. So
and then a little bit of Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skip through because there's some stuff on my screen that you can't see. So I shall think about where the most kind of interesting stuff goes. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with the layout part of this, and then I'll skip some of the images stuff at the end because I think that it's layout that people are often keen to learn more about.
It's worth reminding people who are listening, who are Smashing members, that they have access to this ebook for free. So if you go to your Smashing membership dashboard, smashingmagazine.com/membership, and make sure you're logged in, you'll be able to get the whole book. If you're not a member, you can buy it. I believe it's $29 for the ebook.
So, just want to quickly just bring everything kind of back to layout just very quickly, because there are these sort of fundamentals and principles of design that I talk about in the book, but I also think should be on the curriculum of, web design courses in the same way as any kind of UX principles or, learning PHP or whatever they do in colleges now. So if we look at these two images, this is just a little exercise that I talk about in the book. There's something that feels wrong here, not just this picture of this baby who is horribly. Maybe it's because we know that in reality, minis are bigger than babies. What is it that feels wrong? Are we looking at a massive baby, or is he just closer to us? Is the mini a full-size car? Is it a toy? Is it in the distance? I know that the last time I checked that minis weren't bigger than elephants. But if we're telling a story about scale, if the story that we're telling or the thing that we want to communicate is that the mini is actually spacious, how many elephants can you get in a mini? Then using scale to tell stories through design is just as effective online as it is or is in print. So for example, I might take something like this and I might just contrast the size and scale of the photograph with the size and scale of the content, which creates this visual hierarchy. And scale on its own, just making everything big, doesn't work because we need something to provide scale. We need to provide something to contrast that scale against, which is why in a layout like this, we might emphasize the size of the mini by making the actual text itself much, much, much smaller than you might expect. So if you look at these two layouts here, the size of the car is exactly the same in both of these layouts, but the impact that the car makes on the left is less because there's a lot more running text that balances out that visual weight. So I can make that mini look a lot bigger, a lot more significant by reducing either the amount or the size of the text content that goes with it. And people often say when I talk about these examples, yeah, how's this going to work on a small screen? How's that going to work on mobile? And you know what? It's actually easy when you think about it. You can maintain this element of scale on a smaller screen. Instead of just shrinking that image down, that three-quarter perspective image of the car down so it fits onto a phone. If we did that, we're going to lose the visual hierarchy of the design. So how do we achieve that visual hierarchy? How do we achieve the impact that car makes on a small screen? Well, keep the bloody image big, but then just have a horizontal scroll that just lets the image bleed off the page, and it adds this element of surprise. It's like, wow, this car keeps going on and on. We can make the image, we can make that mini have much, much more impact and focus by combining it with an amount of white space. It doesn't have to be huge. By making it intentionally mini, but then introducing a whole bunch of white space around it, it becomes that kind of perfect counterpoint to this large block of copy that sits at the bottom. This is really similar to those 1960s think small campaign ads for VW in America. And we can do that on small screens too. We just need to think about, what are we actually trying to achieve here? The thing that we're talking about is scale. We do that through a visual hierarchy. How are we going to achieve this on different sizes of screens? So that, I think, is kind of the end of what I really want to talk about today. Like Bruce says, I could go on for an entire day talking about this kind of stuff. But I think in summary, what I really want people to realize is that this is not and this is the main point that comes through the book, is that art direction is not something that an art director does. You don't need to have an art director in your studio, in your company. But what we do need to have is we need to have people that consider art direction in everything that they do. It's not a special thing like accessibility that you think, let's do our art direction checklist. What this really is about really seriously thinking about the content, the functionality, how we want people to feel, how our brand values translate into what people actually see and do when they're using a product or visiting a website, and how do we emphasize those messages through design. And this is something which should just be done as part of the design process, in exactly the same way as we should consider accessibility or performance or anything else. It's got to be part of what we do every day. And it is something that everyone can do. It takes a good eye, but that's something that can be taught, and it takes a bit of practice. But everything to do with becoming an accomplished designer or developer takes practice. But this is really about a plea almost from me to really seriously think about design as that creative medium which communicates things better to audiences, rather than doing the trap that we seem to have fallen into over the last decade or so, which is making attractive containers and then just kind of dropping stuff in it. So there we go. That's my rant over, basically. Thank you very much for that.
It's a very very cogent rant, sir. It's worth pointing out, or it's worth my suggesting, that we're now in an era in which art direction is kind of particularly not easy, because that's developing it as a skill, but we finally have the tools with CSS, etc., that we can use to accomplish art direction. And a bit of a plug next week, Smashing Members. For Smashing Members only, it's costs the same as 2 cups of coffee a month. Andy's going to be giving a webinar once a month, which is going to be inspired by a particular art director or a particular directed piece.
Yeah.
And not only talk about why it's good and why it's effective, but show us how we can do similar without mimicry in HTML and CSS using modern web standards. So there will be code. That's the Inspired by series, which begins next Tuesday at 4 p.m. and will be every month. Anyway, there are questions, and I'm conscious of the fact that we have 11 minutes left on the clock.
Well, I'm happy to hang around if people want to hang around.
That's kind, but Scott will be evicted from the room. So
I can move. That's not a huge problem.
So,
I do have my first question, which is going to be a quick yes or no, or basically that. Getaway car, Mini Cooper or Volkswagen R? Andy?
Oh, Mini Cooper, obviously.
Ah.
What the hell?
That's not even a question. That's just that's like, would you like ice cream or a punch in the nose? There's nothing to consider, is there?
I mentioned this on my blog post very, very quickly. I mentioned this on my blog post the other day, but I am completely obsessive over all of the content that goes into the examples that I put in my books. I can't look at something and see a browser tab or, you know, anything that's out of order. And I certainly can't put things like lorem ipsum into these examples. I know people might not even notice, but I notice. So I actually had my wife last year do a whole ton of research on how to get away, how to buy a false passport, how to talk to car, which countries in the world didn't have extradition treaties with the UK. And she got very, very anxious about her search history at that point.
Good idea to get Sue to do it.
I think I've seen Vitaly do similar presentation. Well, not similar, but similar content in terms of airport hacks and whatnot. So now we should maybe get on the real questions.
Go on.
One of them, do you think design systems will be helpful about art direction, or will they just cause more bootstrap-like websites and ideas?
That's a very good question. And it is something that I talk a little bit in the book. Gentleman by the name of Josh Clarke, no relation, wrote an article a year or two ago that said design systems should be boring. And he's absolutely right. Design systems are incredibly useful tools. I'm building one right now for my main client in Switzerland, because we need to have a series of, you know, first of all, it's, you know, you only want to solve one problem once. We don't want to be creating, you know, multiple instances of search inputs or, you know, form elements or whatever that might be. We certainly need to create what I call foundation styles, which is our color palette, our typography hierarchy, the combinations of typefaces, all of the things that make a design distinctive to a particular brand. Those things can be codified. Those things should be in a system. But that means that basically what we're talking about there is I'm going to free up all of my time that I would have spent redesigning the same thing over and over again. And I can then use that time to think more carefully about being creative and expressive, whether it would be an article or a login screen or an onboarding process or whatever it might be. And a design system should include or be flexible enough to allow you to design outside it.
Bruce, sorry, 1 second here.
Sorry, Timothy Fox asked, do you find, Andy, when you can get away with it without detracting from the story, that less is more when taking design considerations?
Yeah.
There we are.
I feel that's a life lesson right there. I incorporate less is more into when I'm playing drums, for example. Less is more.
I mean, okay, let's give this a proper answer. There's always this tension between being expressive and being, you know, functional. And, you know, there's a whole series of, you know, a whole school of design that I bet lots of UX people love. You know, they love Dieter Rams and, you know, that whole kind of school of design that pairs everything back to its absolute kind of essence. And, you know, there's always this tension between what am I trying to achieve and what do I try to express? And whatever way we're doing it, just adding stuff in for decoration, or adding anything unnecessarily is potentially going to detract from the things that you do want to feel important, or you want people to focus on. You know, why would you throw something on a page if it was, you know, detracting from the core message, be that, you know, the meaning through an article or where you want somebody to click in a CTA or anything like that. So, yeah, less is more.
those were the main questions. There was one. I think I have a couple more minutes, but I don't want to cut Bruce off. Do you have any questions, Bruce?
I don't. I've asked mine.
And I think Andy, for the most part, you've explained it. It's kind of I've been doing the web. We were one of the first families in our city in Canada to, not the city of Canada, but the city that we were living in Canada, to get the internet in 1995. And that was when I started doing HTML. But there's always been a gap to, and I think you used the term "bridge the gap" in one of your books, about bridging the gap between designers and developers. And as Bruce had mentioned, the tools that are available now compared to 1995, 1996,
yeah,
it's a night and day difference. But there still are a lot of people that have been designing for 20, 30 years that have only been doing print design. So is there any one thing that you could maybe suggest, or maybe not one thing, but is there anything that you could kind of bring to the forward for print designers that haven't really touched the web that may be watching this, in terms of kind of a way to bridge the gap between print and web?
Well, I mean, that is a really good question. I mean, it always kind of annoys me when people trot out the whole, the web is not print thing, as if somehow print is old and the web is new, and that there's nothing that we can learn from different media. I think that's bullshit. The one thing I would say in terms of this kind of bridging of gap, it's the same conversation as you would have between designers and developers. If you have a print designer, that person will have generally an understanding of lots of the stuff that I talk about in the book, be it typography hierarchy or grids or layout or ways in which you connect content and you lead people across a layout, which is not necessarily a skill that a UX designer or a general web designer is going to have. So there's a lot of important experience there that print designers have. They might not know the latest, what's possible in the latest CSS. They might not know how to implement that. But the way in which you bridge that gap is to bloody well put people together. And, that's something that I'm very, very keen on doing with, my workshops, is to say, what can we learn from print design? What can we learn from, decades or 100 years of art direction? What can we learn from that? Think about what problem we're trying to solve online, and then apply it in a way which makes sense for our medium. And that's what's important.
That's a perfect way to finish today, and to lead into the fact that, as Shakespeare said, when shall we three meet again? It'll be us three, and hopefully you, gentle viewers, next Tuesday at 4 p.m. GMT for the first of Andy's Inspired by webinars, when we'll be looking at skinny columns in a magazine whose name I've forgotten. I'm sorry, Andy.
Avant.
That's the one. So thank you ever so much, Andy. That was really fascinating.
Pleasure, mate.
Ladies and gentlemen listening, I keep meaning, I shouldn't say ladies and gentlemen. Folks listening, you can download the book if you're a Smashing member, or you can pay a small amount of money and download it. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye all.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye.